What would win in a fight? One Ouroboroid-sized Gran or 100 Gran-sized Ouroboroids? Find out this answer and many more coming up in the Spotlight Analysis. A double dose of Spotlight series, the Avatar, just finished up in Lyon and Atlanta, and if you can't tell by the scroll bar on the bottom of the video, we got a lot to talk about as we analyze both of these events together. We have some new things that are going to be happening, but if you're brand new to this metagame recap, you can just look down below and you can find the sections that you want to jump to in the description there. However, if you want to stick around and figure out what we're going over in this video, well, we're going to be starting by looking at the overall metagame breakdown. What were the decks that were played between the two events and in what capacity? After that, we're going to be narrowing it down to the most popular decks in the room. We're going to be doing some popularity tier analysis where I break down the different decks into tiers so you can kind of compare them amongst themselves, as well as get a feel for what the most popular decks were in the room at a glance, so you can expect, okay, maybe I'll run into these at an RCQ or in my Magic the Gathering online or arena queues as I'm playing through standard, and get an idea of what to expect and see how they kind of stack up against each other in regards to the field. Then we're going to be looking at the top 10 win rate decks, and we're going to be doing it in two different flavors this time around. The first one is going to be looking at no specific sample size, so this is going to be getting some of those one deck wonders where there's only a single copy of the archetype between the two events that does extremely well. This is like the Brewer's Paradise area of that type of analysis. And then we're going to be doing this same exact thing, top 10 win rates, but we're going to be putting a caveat on the number of decks that had to be at the event in order to qualify for this. In this case, we're looking at different archetypes that had at least 4 or more copies between the two events, and this is going to kind of hone down more as a metagame look at what is performing well in the overall metagame. Speaking of that, we're going to be looking at the top 10 presence decks from the event and judging their head-to-head matchups in a full-on matchup matrix between those decks. Now, I don't want to hold up the analysis too much because we've already got a ton of video, but very quick data caveats. We are using the Melee platform's results for both of these events. There are 1,546 registered players between these events. Not all of them had deck lists, and I did have to go through and clean up some of the archetype names. Some of it was just for ease of access, like turning the Simic Coma into Simic Omniscience and marrying those together, or Boros Aggro into Boros Prowess, marrying those together, and things like that. Other things I have done is going through and section out a couple of different lists, Simic Ouroboroid versus Simic Jackal for the lists that we're still running some of the older technology from those lists, as well as kind of going through and figuring out what different flavors of mono red there were. And I've done a bunch of things like that, and there's a big changelog that I'll link somewhere down in the description below that I tweeted out a little bit earlier. So if my results look a little bit different between some of the other analysis pieces you've seen, it's because I've gone into a little bit more specifics with my deck archetype list, and I'm counting everything from the Swiss rounds all the way through the top 8. We're going to be going over absolutely every single list. Buys do not count, ties still do count, and there are metrics that care about win rate minus ties, so stay tuned for that when you look through this analysis. But hopefully that's been pretty short, actually over a minute, so let's just get to the analysis. I'm talking too much. Once we clean things up between both of the events, there were 138 different deck archetypes across the two Spotlight Avatar events that got played. Now, of all of these different deck archetypes, 62 of them were the only type of deck that were in the rooms across the two continents, making up 44.9% of the deck archetype breakdown. Meanwhile, 22 different deck archetypes had at least 2 copies in the rooms, making up 15.9% of the same deck archetype share. If we want to find different archetypes with at least 3 copies in the room, there are 12 of those, which make up 8.7% of the deck archetype share. And if we move on to archetypes with 4 copies in the room, we have 8 for 5.8% of that deck archetype metagame. There was only 1 archetype that had 5 copies in the room, so 0.7% of that deck archetype share, while there were 2 different archetypes that had at least 6 copies across the two events for 1.4% of that deck archetype share. 3 different archetypes wound up having 8 copies in the room. That's a 2.2% share of the same deck statistic, while there was only 1 archetype that had 9 different copies across the 2 events for a 0.7% metagame share, similar to the 5 in the room. Now, if we take a look at all of the different deck archetypes that had at least double-digit copies between the 2 events, you wind up having 27 different deck archetypes that are making up the large majority of the different decks you will see across these 2 events, including, unfortunately, players that had no deck list registered. There were 10 of those, but it still makes up 19.6% of the overall deck archetype metagame. Let's take a look at that 19.6%, as it's going to make up a large majority of the field. Like Izzet Lessons, the most played deck across both events, had 221 pilots for 14.3% of the metagame breakdown. But not too far behind that one was a big bad Ouroboroid deck. The Simic Ouroboroid deck had 200 different pilots for 12.9% of the field. Now, undeterred by the fact that there are 2 different decks in the room now that are splashing blue in different ways, Dimir Midrange still had 147 loyal pilots for a 9.5% share of the metagame, which was the 3rd highest for all these deck archetypes. Now, if you want to look at 3 color decks, Jeskai Control tried to slow things down. 130 pilots made up 8.4% of the metagame share between these 2 spotlight events, while the Sultai Reanimator deck, or the Sultai Superior Spider-Man deck, or Sultai Living End, whatever you want to call it, 83 different pilots, 5.4% of the metagame share. Now, a different take on the Izzet style of deck with Izzet Looting had 66 different pilots with 4.3% of the metagame share across the weekend of events, while the mono-red aggro deck that was using Ohier Axonil and all of the pingers when opponents drew cards, 57 different pilots brought this major red archetype for 3.7% share of the metagame. The Landfall decks had a big showing at this event in different capacities. Mono green Landfall here had 45 pilots for 2.9% of the metagame share, while a quick splash of white, mostly for sideboard cards, so similar to mono green, although a little bit different mono base, 44 pilots, 2.8% of the metagame share. Now, rounding out the top 10 presence decks across the 2 events is Boros Aggro, or a Boros Burn / Prowess type shell. It's got Lightning Helix, it's got Boros Charm, it's got Slick Shot Show Off, all the classics, 39 pilots for 2.5% of the metagame. Now it's time for us to shift gears away from what made up the event as a whole and just focus on what was most popular at the event using my popularity tier analysis. Now this section looks to identify what was played the most at an event and compare it to the other decks within the same tier of popularity using a distribution of deck archetypes at the event, which uses standard deviation to assign tiers from D at 1 deviation below the average all the way up to S, the highest deviation above the average. Now this does a little more than just look at how high the metagame share was and can reaffirm if a deck was a good choice for an event at all. Now, while this is not a be-all, end-all overview of the format, this analysis looks to help in preparation for your own events at your LGS or online, as you can expect to see more of the higher tier decks compared to the lower tier ones, but then you can also assess if you need to prepare more or less for them based on their performance. With so many different deck archetypes at this event, in addition to the fact that the top of the table decks have a like number of decks across the 2 events, we wind up with a fairly large S tier in popularity, which is going to encompass a lot of what the decks are going to be that you run into Magic the Gathering Online or at your up-and-coming RCQs this season for Standard. Now, taking a look at these decks compared to one another, we're really going to start to see kind of like a power ranking of the decks in and of themselves. Let's start with the one on the bottom this time around in Dimir Midrange. 9.5% of the metagame decided to take the Kaito and Company deck to the event, and while it has been putting up some wins in leagues and challenges and stuff throughout Magic the Gathering Online, the Dimir deck is not very well positioned for either Izzet Lessons or Simic Ouroboroid in a grand scheme of things. Well, when we get to the head-to-head matchup matrix, we'll see how true or false that is going to be, but it is the running sentiment around the deck. Now, overall, Dimir can can build in certain ways to combat these two decks. You have Day of Black Sun as something from the Avatar set that's able to take care of a bunch of the go wide angle from like the Ouroboroid decks that Dimir was struggling with before that set came out. However, when you tweak the deck one way, it's a bit of a mid-range toolbox deck that wants to keep tempo, which means that the other directions are going to kind of falter because of it. That's where you see this deck specifically having such a lower win rate overall when compared to the rest of the S tier popularity decks. Jeskai Control, in a sort of similar area. In general, control decks really are a product of the metagame that they are building for, and when the Jeskai decks are going to be building to either combat Izzet or Ouroboroid, there isn't a ton of overlap between those two distinct archetypes. We'll see which one the pilots at these two events decided to attack specifically when we look at the head-to-head matchup matrix, but we can see here that Jeskai Control fared a little bit better than Dimir, but was still running at a below 50% win rate across the two events, which means that if you are going to be taking a deck like these into an event, you really need to know what you're going to be facing. Otherwise, you may want to take something that has a better matchup against the field. Now, Izzet Lessons was kind of the deck to beat ever since Worlds, and a 51.1% win rate does show that it had an above 50% win rate between these two events, which means that it is still packing a powerful punch to itself. Now, the Izzet Lessons deck didn't really go over a ton of changes. The big thing is going to be if you're running Storm Chaser's talent or not, and what the adaptations to that was going to be. But overall, this core theme of Artist Talent, Monument to Endurance, Grand, and the Lessons package is still packing a punch in Standard. Now, the Simic Ouroboroid deck is the biggest of these decks that was kind of out of not necessarily nowhere, but coming into the trough between Worlds and these Spotlight events. Now, Ouroboroid is a very powerful card, and Simic deck underwent a couple of transformations from a deck that was going wide with Jackal, which still has some presence at this event, we'll talk about maybe a little later on, as well as just going even further wide with smaller creatures. Now, the Ouroboroid and the Quantum Riddler package gave that kind of aggro shell a bit of a boost into the later stages of the game, and we don't necessarily see them playing like a tempo and interaction style, keep our small things alive. It's just like Haymaker after Haymaker at Nature's Rhythm to really keep the battlefield stocked and ready to go, even if there's a board wipe that follows up. So 54.5% win rate for the Ouroboroid deck. Looking at its comparison between these other three decks, or with the four decks altogether, it is definitely ahead of the rest of them, although Izzet Lessons with a giant target on its back was not far behind at these events. So Sultai Reanimator is our only A-tier deck between these two events, and it's kind of interesting because the Sultai Reanimator deck was something that was poised to be extremely popular, especially after it had top 8 performance at Worlds and was kind of the de facto combo deck of the format. I mean, you can kind of consider Izzet Lessons a combo deck. I consider it an engine deck because you have an engine that's working for you. Sultai Reanimator deck was really a living end kind of combo shell that was going at it. However, due to the popularity of Izzet Lessons, the Reanimator deck was taking some additional slack and some damage from it. A 44.1% win rate while people are starting to pick up on running Soul Guide Lantern and Rest in Peace in their sideboard makes it difficult for the Reanimator deck to really make up for some of the lost ground. Now, there are a couple of different packages that are floating around, whether it's Craterhoof Behemoth or Terror of the Peaks, but overall, these packages were just not packing the same punch that they were a couple of weeks or maybe a month or so ago. Now, for Sultai Reanimator fans, I think this A-tier popularity is basically where the deck is going to be for a little while, especially with the hype coming in from Lorien Eclipse and having some of those evoke elementals from that cycle coming in. There's ones that can destroy an artifact, or sorry, exile an artifact or enchantment when you evoke it, and then it goes into your graveyard. You could bring it back later with your sort of Bringer of the Last Gift, Sultai Spider-Man, Living End combo. So you have ways to kind of interact with some of the hate that the opponents are going to be throwing at you, and it makes it more awkward for that Soul Guide Lantern to just sit on the battlefield on turn 1. So Sultai Reanimator does have a lower win rate than even Dimir Midrange did in the previous tier, but I do think things could be looking up for it, although then again, it is more metagame dependent. If people start sideboarding more for Simic or Ouroboroid and less for the Lessons deck, then Sultai Reanimator's win rate is going to go up, but looking at it right here, in and of itself, within its own tier of A tier, it's not looking that too hot. B tier has a few decks that kind of fall into like that tier 2 of the metagame, or in some cases the up and rising section of it. Let's talk about the good before we talk about the bad. So those rising landfall decks, mono green landfall, Selesnya landfall, they're basically the same flavor. The Selesnya deck does have some better sideboard options. You have Felidar Retreat, you have some Get Lost, and of course you can bring in things like Rest in Peace if you're really afraid of some of the graveyard based synergies. But all in all, you're going to basically harmonizer your way into a victory. Now, Landfall does have some sort of Scales-esque gameplay patterns where you can wind up doubling the power of something, but stacking your triggers from Earthbender Ascension and putting counters on things, and then doubling after the counters go on, and making for these kind of like exponential growing things. I think we wind up seeing like Chocobos getting into the hundreds in some games, whether it be between games that were quoted at the Spotlight series or just watching people's streams playing these landfall decks. So they are kind of the de facto aggro deck in the format right now, and it really just depends on if you need some additional heat pieces or some extra little oomph to your package if you go for the Selesnya combo or the mono green combo. And speaking of the other aggressive decks in the format, the mono red aggressive deck adapted its package of pinging threats again, but this time actually went all the way up the curve to the 4-mana god from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, Ohir Axonil. So it turned all those 1 damage pings into 4 damage pings. This is something that was played around with a little bit in previous iterations of Standard, when Winter Night Stories and all these draw discard looting effects are very popular in the format for these Izzet shells. However, the Ohir Axonil was more of a sideboard option. Now it's being played in the main deck because of a lot of additional card draw from the Lessons decks. We have card draw coming in from Quantum Riddler and basically every blue shell, so people are trying to punish their opponents for being proactive with their card advantage. It didn't really wind up working out, and it does slow the red deck down considerably. That and the fact that you're missing Screaming Nemesis a ton. So you have Sunspine Links in a 4-mana slot, now you have Ohir Axonil in a 4-mana slot, your 3-mana slot is basically a Warped Nova Hellkite, and you're missing a lot of the glue between like your first couple of turns and then the kind of closing the door on people at 5 and 6, where you really wanted to be with the old mono red aggressive shell. So even though it is tech to beat up on some of these card draw engine decks, it doesn't necessarily mean that the mono red deck is poised against the rest of the metagame. The Izzet Looting Shell is a little different than the way that the Izzet Lesson shell is going to play. You're looking at things more like Duelist of the Mind. You have those draw and discard effects. You're trying to really give yourself actual card draw, and so you kind of actually match up poorly against this mono red aggro deck unless you're using your bounce spells to get rid of their pingers, which is another kind of slight against the mono red deck. However, you have Frostcliff Siege to really help you kind of close the gap against some of these other decks, but you are playing a little bit more to the board and more susceptible to just in general creature removal, which a lot of decks are going to be using when Ouroboroid is one of the best cards in the format, and Quantum Riddler is not too far behind it, if not ever so slightly ahead of it. So when you wind up playing more creatures to the board, and because they are a lot smaller, a lot more things wind up killing them, and the Izzet looting list is looking a little less good than the Izzet Lessons deck at a 48.9% overall win rate. C tier has a ton of decks, which I would kind of consider like the rogue decks that you may encounter in a room when you go to an RCQ or something, save for the one that was actually called the rogue deck on coverage, Ban Airbending, which wound up winning one of these Spotlight events. So go figure, that deck had a 53.4% win rate overall for 24 different pilots, and it wound up winning one of the Spotlight events. So eyes are definitely going to be on Ban Airbending to basically in the future as one of the decks that's probably going to jump up some of these tiers now that people are figured out a way to kind of get good with it again. Similarly, we see more Ouroboroid decks here, the Golgari flavor of it, something I'm actually pretty fond of here, 53.1% win rate. This one's going to be running a slightly different package. You have Lively Dirge and Overlord of the Baelmerk in the deck to make it a little more recursive and let you find your things kind of like tutor style almost, as opposed to just drawing cards with like Quantum Riddlers and stuff and then having, once they're in hand, copying them at Mockingbirds and such like the Simic version is. So a little bit more of a tutory package. Sometimes you're packing a little bit more removal too, but most of it is one going into the sideboard now. We also have Izzet Prowess a little bit further down the list. That one actually stepped up a little bit more than the Izzet Looting deck, even though the Looting deck was kind of the one that people were feeling more favorable before the event or even just coming out of Worlds in general. The Prowess deck does have a little bit more more of that speed angle and is kind of filling in that hole where the mono red deck is starting to fall out. Although, you know, the Landfall decks are also kind of coming into their own in that spot too. Looking at the rest of this list here, we can see the Simic Jackal version of the Ouroboroid deck had a much lower win rate than the just going bigger Simic Ouroboroid with the Mockingbird package. Jackal and Mockingbird can exist in some of these shells together. However, you wind up usually cutting the Mockingbirds to put Jackal in and then kind of fixing your curves so that you're not playing a Mockingbird at a lower mana cost than your Jackal power or way too high up to really buff your Jackal. But in general, going a little bit more aggressive, let you peter out a little bit earlier, you were more explosive, but the Simic Jackal list had 42.6% win rate compared to Simic Ouroboroid over there at 54.5% and like 10 times the amount of pilots playing it. Another deck that you should be on the lookout for is the 4-color Allies deck. This deck is mostly avatar cards. It was highlighted on coverage a couple of times this weekend, and in general plays very similar to a humans deck in Modern. You obviously don't have Aether Vial and ways to cheat things into play like that, but it is extremely synergistic within its own creature type and is very, very reminiscent of just the Allies creature type in general and how those decks always sort of played out previously. Azorius Midrange is a slight twist on that too. If you look at some of the card choices here, you wind up going away from some of the allies and adding in things like Lightstall Inquisitor, Aven Interrupter, and you play a bit more of a tempo-based game and really kind of are able to abuse High Noon main deck against decks like Izzet Lessons and some of the more aggressive decks that are throwing down multiple things in a turn. That Azorius Midrange deck, 51.8% of the metagame. That might be something that some of the Dimir pilots start shifting towards if they want to play that tempo kind of mid-range style of gameplay to interact with their opponents. Lastly, I do want to touch upon Boros Aggro. This is kind of a culmination of a couple different decks. Some were labeled Boros Prowess, some were labeled Boros Aggro. In general, they have Slickshot Show Off, they have Lightning Helix, they have Boros Charm, all of the classic kind of burn, aggressive shell type things. Some of them were packing things like more of the Prowess side of things. Some were packing just the general mono red aggro style of stuff, but it does look like that white splash, whether it be for the extra burn spells or potential things like Get Lost to be able to attack decks that do go bigger than the aggro side can. 51.8% win rate. Boros Aggro is where those red mages should be looking at right now. Let's step away from the popularity contest and instead look at what decks were doing the most winning, regardless of how many copies were in the room at the event. Now, this is going to be looking at overall win rate in the percentage of games won, not total wins or total games played. This is going to allow us to look for some of those sleeper OP decks, even though they weren't out in full force this weekend, and it's going to be able to put that in perspective based on how successful they were in the hands of smaller amounts of pilots. Now, the caveat is these are 2-day events, which means that some of these lists could have not made day 2 despite having a positive record. So as always, keep in mind the sample size because it does matter when you're thinking about breaking the format. I've already sung the praises of Mono Green and Selesnya Landfall, so let's take a look at Michael Kundegraber's Bant Landfall deck, which went 11-4-0, good for 25th place overall in Lyon. Now, I wish I could say there were more blue cards in this list to make it more Banty. However, it's just Winter Night Stories. There are 4 copies of Get Lost and a singleton copy of Felidar Retreat in the main deck, which is similar or different than some of the Selesnya Landfall list, but we're basically running blue for the card draw spell. The sideboard does have some additional white cards, Felidar Retreat, 1 Seam Rip, and 4 copies of Day of Judgment, so Michael may have been expecting a lot of those Ouroboroids. Now, there are 2 copies of Bossing Say in the list as well, so you can wipe your board, activate Earthbending onto one of your lands, and then very quickly, after a Cracked Fabled Passage or Escape Tunnel, Earthbender essentially your way to victory with just your lands. You're not running Saw's Chocobo, you do wind up only having Badgermole Cub, Ice Till Explorer, Llanowar Elves, and Mightform Harmonizer, so it's a little bit more lean version of the Landfall deck you gotta try to navigate. Boros Goblins in the hands of Glenn DiGirolamo was a deck that graced the top of the tables at SCG Con Atlanta Spotlight Series, going 9-6-0 across the event with a deck that actually had 0 copies of Cavern of Souls. Instead, the deck was a lot more aggressive with its card choice, going from tried and true versions of goblins like Burnout Bastronaut and Fanatical Firebrand, all the way up to cards like Sear Slicer Goblin and the Dropkick Bomber to to send things into the air. Howl Squad Heavy was able to give the goblins haste and was sort of your Goblin Lord effect, your Goblin Chieftain and your like Legion War Boss type Goblin Rabble Master all on the same card, giving you tokens, giving you haste, etc. While different cards like War Leader's Call were able to punish your opponents by just playing your cards on curve and swarming the battlefield with your goblins. There was a bit of a backup plan in some Boros Burn package with 4 copies of Burst Lightning in the main deck, 2 copies of Shock, and then 4 Boros Charm in the sideboard, which can also beat some of those board wipe effects by giving things indestructible at instant speed. However, the rest of the deck was crafted around the fact that you're going to be slamming goblins on the battlefield as quickly as possible and trying to go aggressive. Frontline Rush is a card that is goblin themed specifically, even though it doesn't have a kindred type, where you can either at instant speed make 2 1/1 goblins like a Raise the Alarm, or pump one of the creatures that is getting through by X, which is the number of creatures you control. So filling a board full of goblins, punishing your opponent by just playing them thanks to War Leader's Call and some of the other effects that you have, and then finishing them off by pumping up its one specific goblin while the rest of them are getting minor pumps was a good game plan to have. Gruul Delirium popped back up into the standard metagame with 4 different decks between these 2 events, with Kevin Sinnhuber going 10-5-0 in Lyon for the most winning deck of this archetype. Now, Violent Urge with a bunch of Delirium enablers is going to be the name of the game here, and even though you're not going to be doing anything with Slick Shot Show Off the way you potentially could in some older formats, Fear of Messing Out, Patchwork Beastie, and a plethora of other cards are going to help you get to your Violent Urge and then turn your Delirium into something that can be a force to be reckoned with. Now, Breakout is one of the big cards in this deck, as you're able to basically pseudo collected company something into play. You still get to look at the top 6 cards of your library, but you only get to put 1 of those cards at mana value 2 or less onto the battlefield, and it gains haste until end of turn. So you are going to be able to just kind of rush something out of nowhere, in addition to things like Wildfire Wickerfolk, which will have haste thanks to getting Delirium, as well as providing multiple creature types or multiple card types in the graveyard. You're going to have a beatdown deck that can be pretty fast and can be pretty furious. The sideboard options for this deck do go a little bit bigger, going up to Chandra Spark Hunter. You have copies of Magebane Lizard to really punish what the Lessons decks are trying to do, and then of course Sunspine Links to kind of cap off your opponents from really gaining all too much life, and then a plethora of burn-based removal spells that actually don't hurt some of your bigger butt creatures like your Patchwork Beasties and your Fear of Missing Outs in Pyroclasm and Fire Magic. So this is going to be a deck that revolves around the graveyard, and if Graveyard Hate goes up, the deck's power goes down. However, if Graveyard Hate is not super present in your metagame, give Gruul Delirium a spin if you're more of an aggressive-minded mage. I don't want to spend too much time on Matthew Takahashi's Temur Prowess list because unfortunately Matthew did not finish all of the matches that they played on day 1 in Atlanta, going 4-3-0 but still having enough of a win rate to show up in these top decks. Now this is a list going back in time to a bit of a different version of Prowess, running Draycatcher, Slick Shot Show Off, and a bunch of pump spells to proc Prowess with, or in this case, spells that will pump by proccing Prowess. There are no more sort of +3/+0 effects in this list. Instead, Burst Lightning is the most damaging kind of source, and Matthew kind of mired together the Prowess and the looting style of decks in here by adding in Frostcliff Siege and a pair of Quantum Riddlers. Now, Elusive Otter and Grove's Bounty is basically the only green card in the main deck, which is just going to be a bit of a pump spell, whereas in the sideboard, we don't actually wind up having any of the green cards that we would think to see, like Paw Patch Formation, Pick Your Poison, or even like Overprotects and Snakeskin Veils to keep your things alive through pumps. So this deck is a bit of a wash, although if you are thinking about adding some of those protection cards to your Izzet Prowess deck, that would be a direction to look. In a similar vein, this Orzhov Flyers list from Marcus Valerie unfortunately barely missed out on day 2 of competition at the Spotlight Series and was packing a plethora of different types of packaged flyers here. Momo Friendly Flyer was the main glue that kind of held everything together, as the first non-lemur spell that you would cast during your turn would cost 1 less, and then whenever another creature you control with flying enters, Momo will get +1/+1, making it a very powerful kind of effect to have. This would work extremely well with Sage of the Skies, where if you cast it as your second spell, then you are going to get a copy of this flying lifelink menace that would now be 2 mana thanks to Momo's cost reduction. However, there were still other things that were working in the deck. Starscape Cleric was able to find a package of 1-drops from Momo to all the way to Cecil, who strangely enough is not a flyer but still made the flying list. And then also Bloodthirsty Conqueror was in here alongside Deep Cavern Bat to give you a little bit of extra oomph on these lower power flyers and turning your life link into not only a survival tool but a weapon. I do think there's a little bit more to explore within this archetype, and I wouldn't mind keeping it to just Momo plus the Bat package, but Sage of the Skies is an interesting card in a space we haven't really been able to explore yet in Standard. Azorius Aggro from pilot Josh Faust was another deck that barely missed out on day 2 at the Spotlight series, but was doing some interesting and powerful things within the Standard format. Now, a kind of mixture of what Dimir Midrange is trying to do, only without Kaito, as well as a little bit of extra bounce package stuff thanks to Sun Pearl Kyrian in the deck. We do wind up having Enduring Curiosity, Flood Pitch Drowner, and a ton of flying, flash, or evasive threats to really kind of hinder what our opponent is doing, in addition to try to get some extra card advantage down on our side. Now, a big factor of this deck is going to be the combination of Aang Swift Savior and Aven Interrupter with main deck copies of High Noon. Being able to consistently answer what your opponent is doing on their turn while shutting down their ability to play on your turn with 4 copies of Voice of Victory in the main deck gave this deck a bit of an edge where it may be lacking in the power department that Dimir has, especially with Kaito and other effects. It makes up for by having this permission and this sort of death and taxes feel to it. You do also get to run copies of No More Lies in the main deck, a very powerful effect in Standard, especially with Exile being relevant with a bunch of Graveyard Matters decks running around, and a couple of copies of Parting Gust. You can kind of blink some of these creatures to get the effect a second time on your opponent's turn. The Golgari Gravefall deck from Gabriel de Temporo was a very powerful combo deck that we actually did a deck tech on not that long ago on my channel. But this one is going to be utilizing Beifong's Bounty Hunters, Bloodghast, and Umbral Collar Zealot to do some shenanigans and loops, especially when you wind up running Festering Gulch as it enters the battlefield, deal 1 damage Desert. So you're able to sacrifice something, put a counters onto your Gulch with Beifong's Bounty Hunters because it earthbends where X is the power of the creature that you sacrifice, and then when you wind up sacrificing the land, you have it come back into play, and then that triggers Bloodghast to come back from the graveyard, so you have this recursive loop. You of course wind up running a bunch of Golgari Midrange All-Stars, Overlords of the Baelmerk, Badger Molcub is in here to help with your extra mana ramp, as well as creating more earthbended lands, as well as Llanowar Elves to ramp you up there. Lively Dirge is able to get you what you need in your graveyard at any time you need it, or bringing it back to the battlefield if it's already there. It hits all of your combo pieces, and then a couple copies of Agatha's Soul Cauldron in Gabrielle's list specifically were able to add that Umbral Collar Zealot ability onto all of your creatures, so as long as you had Beifong's Bounty Hunters with a counter on it, it could basically do all of the work for you. This deck did suffer from all the graveyard hate that was kind of floating around, and unfortunately, it's a bit of a known quantity, even though there was only 1 copy of the deck in the room in Lyon, so this was a deck that I think can be iterated on and can be taken to smaller events to much success, but in larger events, especially ones where there's multiple graveyard decks already flying around, it's going to be a little more difficult to get that same surprise factor out of it. We heard rumblings of Boros dragons, but how about Mardu dragons that Pilot Tempest 77 took to Lyon, once again using Momo-friendly fire in cahoots with Sarkhan Dragon Ascendant to really make all of these high-cost, impactful dragons cost more applicable things to an aggressive Standard environment. Big plus sides from running a Dragons package is the fact that you can run Cavern of Souls, but also Clarion Conqueror, which has some fun interactions for your Badger Molcub opponents. Caustic Exhale becomes a very powerful 1-mana removal spell for a large majority of the format if you are able to meet the Behold the Dragon cost, which this deck does in spades. Now you're splashing into Mardu and running black, you get the Dragon-sided board wipe makeup of Scavenger Regent, as well as access to cards like Inevitable Defeat that cannot be countered and can basically deal with any permanent your opponent has on the side of the battlefield, while doing a bit of a Lightning Helix impression as well. Sideboard still gives you access to a bunch of hate cards like Magebane Lizards and Doorkeeper Thralls that are in these colors to just kind of tax and hate on specific decks in the format, but unfortunately for Tempest, the deck did not make day 2, and the Black Splash was not rewarded compared to its Boros companions. Mono Blue Blink was a tempo shell utilizing the power of Splash Portal and Quantum Riddler in the hands of an experienced veteran Ben Sek over at the Spotlight series in Lyon. It was dropping all those other colors that we were splashing, just returning back to its Mono Blue tempo roots. Now, if it was just Quantum Riddler and Splash Portal, this deck wouldn't have a lot going for it. However, it did utilize the all-powerful Storm Chasers talent and Boomerang Basics package, as well as Hydro-Man Fluid Felon to be kind of its Tempest Djinn-esque card from Standards past. By getting +1/+1 until end of turn for each blue spell you cast on your turn, it was a powerful 2-mana threat that just wound up growing as you played more and more things throughout your turn, or even rewarded you for just warping your Quantum Riddler instead of hard casting it later in the game. Now, it did wind up mana ramping you a tiny bit as well, as it was a land on your opponent's turn, so you basically were always up 1 mana in a tempo shell. That's a pretty powerful thing to be in, a good place to be in these games. Now, there's a ton of bounce-based removal into the Flood Maws, Get Outs. We had Spell Pierces as well to kind of be more on the permission side, and Ben even wound up running 2 copies of Harbinger of the Tides, which for 2 extra mana could come down for 4 on your opponent's turn and return a tapped attacking creature to their hand. So there was a lot of stall, a lot of delay, and eventually bigger things on the battlefield that could break its way through. Now, unfortunately for Ben, it didn't make day 2, so I do think that there could be a little bit of tuning for the Mono Blue Blink shell, or you might have to splash an additional color to kind of push it over the edge. Simic Otters had 2 different decks across the Spotlight series, while Sebastian Saxey was the pilot of the only deck that made day 2, but unfortunately it was halted at a 6-5-0 record on the 2-color Otter deck. Now, this one we do have an idea of what it was doing. Valley Flood Caller, Enduring Vitality, having the ability to tap, untap, make a bunch of mana with your Otters, pump absolutely everything up. Storm Chaser's talent provides the Prowess tokens to do so, and we're of course running Boomerang Basics to bounce things back to hand and do things like this town at Big Enough was doing in previous iterations of Standard. Now, the other side of this is that Quantum Riddler and Splash Portal make an appearance in this deck, and Valley Flood Caller makes our Splash Portal instant speed. So we can do it on our opponent's turn, we can do it to Quantum Riddler on our own turn, and we can even do it in response to a removal spell, or we can just use it on our own Otters like Thunder Trap Trainer to get repeated value out of them. So the Simic Otters deck was dropping the red, which means that it didn't have as much burn-based removal or exile effects like Torch the Tower, but it did streamline the mana base a little bit easier to make Enduring Vitality a bit easier to cast. That means that in the sideboard, you're running more counter magic and running more enchantment and artifact hate, Heritage Reclamation, Annuls. We ended up putting some negates in there as well, and then into the Flood Maw was split between the main deck and the sideboard. So although the Otters list didn't necessarily have the oomph to push it far into the Spotlight tournament, it is still alive and kicking in multiple different iterations throughout Standard. Now, you may have noticed that a lot of the decks in the previous section were what I like to call one-day wonders. There's maybe 1 or 2 copies of the deck, and they didn't have that deep of a run into the tournament, so we don't have a very large sample size as to test how strong they are against the metagame. Well, this next section is going to be looking at pretty much the exact same win rate statistics that we were looking at previously, only now sample size matters. We are only looking at deck archetypes that had at least 4 or more copies into the room, so you're going to get a better picture of how these decks did against the field, and this is where you're going to be looking for some of those sleeper rogue decks that could break out in the format over the next couple of weeks with some tweaking. Alright, well, maybe a little bit of a flavor fail. The first deck and the most winning deck of these 4 or more archetypes is actually going to be Gruul Delirium, which we talked about in the previous section anyway. That's just how well the deck archetype did overall. Now, this is a deck archetype that has floated around for a little bit, so it's not surprising to see it continue to pop up in this section as well when multiple pilots were still attracted to the deck. Now, there were 2 copies of this deck that went 10-5-0 across both of the events, one in Atlanta by Zachary Augustine and one in Lyon by Kevin Sinnhuber. Now, the decks were built a little bit differently differently. In Lyon, we wound up actually using some of these Saga creatures like Summon Brynhildr in order to get those extra card types into our graveyard, whereas the version in Atlanta that Zachary was piloting did not do that and instead just kind of maximize on having Keen-Eyed Curator in the main deck, that its own graveyard was going to fuel for multiple card types to pump it up to a giant raccoon, as well as hate on some of the graveyard-based decks like Lessons and the Sultai Reanimator lists that were floating around. So overall, this Gruul Delirium deck is still a pretty good choice for an aggressive shell in Standard, and there are a couple of different ways that you can build it. So it might be worth exploring which one could attack your specific metagame between the two different lists that did well at the event, or seeing if you can build it in your own kind of style and if it works out for you at your RCQs. All right, it's the point in the video where we talk about one of the most popular, most powerful decks in the format, Simic Ouroboroid. Now this deck had a 54.5% win rate across both events against the field and actually wind up winning the Spotlight Series in Lyon in the hands of Simon Nielsen. Who else but the Dane would have taken that list and completely dominated with it. Now, the switch from being a more Jackal aggressive focused list into running copies of Quantum Riddler and using that to sustain itself from the aggressive explosive early game off of the back of Mockingbirds or Ouroboroids and Badger Mole Cubs specifically, which you're going to be targeting with your Mockingbird most of the time to get to things like Craterhoof Behemoth and Quantum Riddler earlier, is going to be a very powerful way to keep the deck going, where it used to kind of putter out and wasn't necessarily as strong in the later stages of the game where it could get out-grinded or out-controlled. Nature's Rhythm, in addition to this, is just a tutor for this deck since we're running 31 creatures in the Spotlight winning one, so there's basically a way to get anything from your deck and kind of do any sort of scenario or any sort of toolboxy things it needs to do. We're running one Keen-Eyed Curator, one Reclamation Sage, one Sentinel of Lost Lore to even get rid of graveyards or things that are on adventures. There's a toolbox feel to this deck that makes me really want to scream like it's a Jund deck more than it is a Simic deck, but it still has that kind of explosive out of the gate mana ramp style that we've seen the Simic decks do for a very, very long time. Now, Spider Sense and even Bounce Off to save your own creatures or get opposing blockers out of the way are just ways that this deck has minimal interaction that is cost effective and powerful in what the metagame is going to be doing. Now, the big thing is, if you want to try to pick up this deck, besides the price tag, is the fact that the sideboard is going to be where you have to try to gain your edges, because a lot of these decks are starting to forego tons of interaction and are just trying to be better on the board. Even in Simon Nielsen's list, we wind up seeing only a couple of counter spells and things to deal with things on the stack. One Disdainful Stroke, one Spider Sense, and then that's pretty much it. We have Meltstrider's Resolve as a fight effect to kind of do some things on the board, and Unable to Scream and Rivian Reed to get rid of like hate pieces or problematic permanents, but there's no interaction, there's no hard removal, there's no like sideboarding in to get rid of your opponent's creatures. It's just doing it better and doing it faster. So getting used to how you need to ramp, what you need to search for, and specifically like Nature's Rhythm math and figuring out the way you can deal the maximum amount of damage, especially when you have two Ouroboroids on the battlefield. Spoiler alert, put the bigger one first so that the smaller one grows and then basically adds all those extra counters on there again. So you're going to have to be doing a little bit of math to optimize your strategy for this deck. It's by no means an easy deck to play, although since you're throwing things down on the battlefield, it does have a bit of a reputation for that. The thing is, Quantum Riddler really helps with your mulligan decisions. If you have to go down to a hand of 5 that has a Badger Mole Cub and a Quantum Riddler in it, as long as you have 3 lands, it's basically a snap keep, because you're going to start recovering from that bad 5-card hand really quickly, especially when other decks like this, especially in the mirror, are not running a bunch of that main deck card removal. Selesnya Landfall had 44 copies across the 2 events and a 54.4% win rate overall against the field, which put it in a very solid 3rd place position. Now, one of my things before the Spotlight Series, my 90-50-10 predictions, was that Landfall was going to make the finals. Now, unfortunately, it did not. It made top 8 in both of the Spotlight events, and specifically Kenneth Oswald getting top 8 in Atlanta had a version of the deck that had no main deck white cards whatsoever. all of them were in the sideboard. So it basically looked like some of those mono green lists that you'd run into in like best of one arena while you're trying to finish your quest, except for the fact it didn't have Tifa. You had Bristly Bill, Saz Chocobo, Mightform Harmonizer, Ice Till Explorer, Badger Mole Cobb, all of the greatest and latest hits from the green side of things, Earthbender's Ascension as well to really make your doubling math and everything from Mightform Harmonizer go up into the triple digits for Magic. But the white splash specifically in Kenneth's list was for sideboard cards. Felidar Retreat gives you another way to utilize your landfall, whether you need to get extra creatures or just extra +1/+1s out of all of your effects, which then again stack with Mightform Harmonizer. But it also gave access to Clarion Conqueror. And like I said before, it has some pretty fun interactions for your Badger Mole Cub opponents. So bringing Clarion Conqueror was also a flying threat from the green deck that you don't really have access to normally. So that was another thing to put counters on top of and then absolutely stomp somebody as they can't wind up blocking. Kenneth's list is another one I want to highlight because of the usage of the Singleton Hunter's Talent. Now, we have the Earthbender's Ascension to get things +1/+1 and trample as soon as we get enough counters on it and we just continue landfalling, but Hunter's Talent is basically a one-sided bite effect as a removal spell that when you level it up for just 2 additional mana, gives an attacking creature +1/+0 and trample until end of turn. So, if you don't wind up having a Saz Chocobo or something like that, or sorry, not a Saz Chocobo, if you don't wind up having something that has trample already from an Earthbender's Ascension, you can wind up giving like your Saz Chocobo very early on in the game when it's still at like 4 or 5 power, trample and making it a magnet for removal while you just have all these other options available like Lumbering World Wagon and everything like that. So you can put trample onto a smaller thing and then Earthbender's Ascension onto a larger thing and make blocking very, very difficult for your opponent. So all in all, I think Selesnya Landfall does have legs. The mono green version is very, very similar, and Kenneth's list didn't even really wind up running Rest in Peace or Get Out as access to some of these sideboard cards that other lists were running between sideboard and main deck. So it does just go to show that the green cards are strong in and of themselves, and that white is definitely just a supporting cast member in these lists. And just to highlight the power of those green cards, let's look at Mono Green Ouroboroid. Now, there are only 4 copies of this deck between the 2 Spotlight events, and only one of them made Day 2 in Lyon in the hands of Tomas Krupicka. No, sorry if I mispronounced that. But all in all, this deck was marrying what some of the Ouroboroid lists were doing with its powerful green cards, and then instead of splashing additional color, just ran Frenzied Baloth, which is a card that I think a lot of people either forgot about or wrote off because of its 2 toughness in the format, but making your spells uncounterable and making it in and of itself uncounterable, and then making your combat damage unable to be prevented. There's not a lot of fog effects in the format right now, but this is just a way to really run over your opponents. It's a 3/2 trample haste for 2 as well, so you're going to be able to swing with it fairly early on or after a follow-up to a Badger Mole Cub play. It's also something that carries these Ouroboroid counters extremely well. Now, you also get to utilize both Ouroboroid and Tyvar the Pummeler in this list, so you're going to be getting +X+X plus counters plus a ton of stuff. It's basically doing the stuff the Landfall deck is doing, but you have to tap some of those earthbended lands and Llanowar Elves in order to do it. Now, Aganosaur Rex was another mono green card that in Aether Drift spoiler season was lauded because it's an 8/8 for 5 mana. But when you cycle it, you can also put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to something, and it gains trample and indestructible till end of turn. So it's also a protection/combat trick that can make awkward blocking situations for your opponent, where your +X+X doubled up counters, all sorts of shenanigans, green creatures all of a sudden trample over their faces for like 20 something damage and kill them. And of course, with now access to Badger Mole Cub, playing an Aganosaur Rex on like turn 3, having an 8/8 for 5, that's pretty good. So Mono Green Ouroboroid lacks the sort of staying power that Simic gives it, lacks the interaction that Mono Black gives it, especially like the tutoring package that Lively Dirge and Overlord of the Baelmerk have, but still has plenty of good things going for it, and maybe something you pivot to if you're not entirely thrilled with the landfall strategy. But if you are thrilled with the Landfall strategy, well, Mono Green Landfall had 45 copies and a 53.9% win rate against the field. I feel like we've covered a lot of what this deck was trying to do when we were talking about the Selesnya Landfall deck, but the mono green version just kind of does it without those sideboard pieces to begin with. So the mono green version of Landfall is still going to be trying to do things with Might Farm Harmonizer. You may lean a little bit more into Ice Till Explorer, because the Ice Till Explorer package is going to be able to give you multiple landfall triggers in a turn, like up to 4 if you have fetch lands, and like your Fabled Passage, you're going to be able to bring it back, fetch, bring it back, fetch in and of itself again and again and again. This is where you may wind up seeing some of the lists go into Tifa Lockhart in the main deck, as well as just a low kind of threat that can really blow things out of the water if it's left unchecked. However, a lot of the decks that did better in the tournament were not running Tifa in general. This does open you up to being able to run cards like Origin of Metal Bending in the main deck as well, so you could potentially wind up just blowing people out of the water by having something that is a main deck hate card against, like Izzet Lessons. So you also get to put a +1/+1 counter on things in a pinch and give it indestructible until end of turn, so it does have some functions like a Snakeskin Veil or something along the lines of that. So it's kind of anti-removal as well as just being a hate piece that you can main deck. So all in all, it just depends what kind of access to cards you want to see from your deck. If you want to just go right down to the face, the mono green version may be a little bit better. Hey, you may even be able to put that Baloth in there too, just make yourself uncounterable. But if you want to have a little bit more flexibility and answers in post sideboard games, you wind up splashing either white, red, something like that in order to give your deck a little bit of an edge in those matches. Bant Airbending, everybody's favorite rogue deck that took down SCG Con Atlanta Spotlight in the hands of Kai Nelson. Now, this deck was something that struggled at Worlds just a couple of months ago, but came back in force, and we don't even have all of its shocklands in the format for another few weekends. So seeing Bant Airbending take the format by storm was something that a lot of people weren't expecting, although it was flavorful justice for the Airbending deck to take down the Avatar Spotlight series. This deck is going to be utilizing Doc Arlok, Grizzled Genius to reduce the cost of all of our airbended spells, so we can use a combination of Aang Swift Savior to airbend Appa, Steadfast Guardian, which then comes in and makes tokens and then airbends, and you just bounce them back and forth so that you wind up having an infinite token army of things. So all in all, it was just a very powerful kind of combo shell, and has a bunch of interaction built in as well, because these airbending spells can usually target your opponent's stuff as well and just delay them from trying to execute their own game plan. So you wind up running Airbenders Ascension, so you wind up having another way to flicker your cards just to have additional effects and additional interaction things. You wind up having Aang at the Crossroads as well, which is just another kind of combo piece. Some of these lists were also running Bramble Familiar and Fetch Quest. Now, if you airbend your Bramble Familiar, you can then cast the Fetch Quest side of it for its airbending cost, which without Doc Arlok on the battlefield is 2, and with Doc Arlok is free. So you wind up doing the thing that some of those Omniscience decks were doing for a little while in Standard, which does seem pretty unfair, because you're able to find your combo extremely well if you are milling 7 cards and putting one of them back onto the battlefield in the process. So the Bant Airbending deck is going to be something that is going to uptick in popularity, A, because it won, and B, because everybody's expecting it to just get better with Lorwyn. The Golgari version of the Ouroboroid deck had a smaller win rate and a smaller sample size than its Simic brethren, with a 53.1% win rate and 20 copies between the Spotlight events. However, it did have a 12th place finish in the hands of Marco Oliveto, playing the deck to an 11-3-1 record over in Lyon. Now, this version of the deck does have some main deck removal. Mainly just 3 copies of Shoot the Sheriff in Marco's list, but then there's also some extra removal in the sideboard package. What this deck does have that the Simic deck doesn't is, because it's not running Quantum Riddler, we have basically effective tutors out the wazoo for all these different Ouroboroid pieces. You still wind up having your Badgermole Cubs, your Gene Pollinators, your Land of Morels, everything that's going to ramp you up to your Ouroboroid, but you have Overlord of the Baelmerk, which helps milth and find things from your graveyard. You have Nature's Rhythm, which both versions of the deck do have, but then you also have additional copies of Lively Dirge, which finds everything from your deck and puts it into play from the graveyard, besides Craterhoof Behemoth or Overlord of the Baelmerk. So you're able to find Ouroboroids, you're able to do interesting things where you bin a Badgermole Cub and can bring 2 back so that you can actually wind up going up in mana if you have 2 creatures that can tap for mana available in play because you pay 5, you get 2 Badgermole Cubs back and they make 6 mana. So there's a bunch of different math-like things you can do with this list while you still pack some of like the more interactive things that the black cards give you, like Shoot the Sheriff and Deep Cavern Bat specifically. Now Deep Cavern Bat also gives you a little bit of an edge because it is a flying creature and these decks don't have a ton of those. So giving you a lifelink flyer does make it so that when you put counters on it with your Ouroboroid, you're going to be putting yourself out of death's reach in just a couple of swings. The sideboard options for this also are a little bit better against some of the control packages because you have access to like 4 copies of Duress and then also copies of Intimidation Tactics that you can use against the Lessons decks to really hate on their artifacts and stuff that they have in their like Monument to Endurance or some of their very few creatures in like the looting lists and stuff like that. You also have Maelstrom Pulse, which is a card that has been reprinted into Standard and just really hasn't seen any play and is very, very good against just a plethora of onboard threats like in the mirrors and things like that. The downside is that if you are in like a mirror type matchup and you remove a Badgermole Cub from your opponent's side of the battlefield, it's also going to destroy your own. So just keep that in mind before you just slam that down onto a board where it's actually going to hurt you more than it's going to help you. Now the Golgari list is a little bit more grindy and does have more traditional kind of answers, and while it does have a very nice tutor package, you lack the hard card advantage that Quantum Riddler gives you, and you don't have that big flyer that is quote unquote always in your hand if you've warped it early on. So this deck does require a little bit more forethought before you slam things on the table, but they do play very similarly, and I'm interested to see if more people pick up Golgari and put 1 or 2 extra main deck removal spells in there to deal with the Simic versions. Izzet Prowess did wind up having 13 copies across both of the events and had a 51.9% win rate overall. Now you may be thinking, why do we not lump the other Temur Prowess deck in here, considering that both of them are using Elusive Otters, Grove's Bounty, and then potentially some sideboard cards? Well, that's because the large majority of the Izzet Prowess decks did not run Slick Shot Show Off. They were just Draycatcher or bust. That was basically the only Prowess creature that they wound up having. Some of them weren't even running Stormchaser's Talent, although Aiden Mirabelli, who took 11th place in Atlanta, did wind up running Stormchaser's Talent and Boomerang Basics. This is basically going to be Stormchaser's Talent, Draycatcher, looping those things, and then continuing to gain advantages off of Quantum Riddler and Fear of Missing Out, giving you card advantage, Frostcliff Siege to give you that extra little bit of oomph and trample to some of these creatures, and then Wild Ride as well as Burst Lightning to really seal the deal against your opponents. So while yes, this deck does have some very similar things going on to it compared to some of the other Temur or other colored Prowess lists, the big thing is no Slick Shot Show Off, and yes on a lot of the extra card advantage to kind of push it over the edge. Azorius Midrange actually had 2 different copies of this deck in the top 64 in Lyon, taking 63rd and 64th place respectively. But the Azorius Midrange deck overall, with a 51.8% win rate, was much like the aggro version, only this one was playing a couple different things like some main deck board wipes and things like that in terms of Avatar's Wrath to make it a little more distinct from the aggro version, playing a couple more creatures, but it was doing very similar Dimir mid-range things. You're playing tempo spells, it played Enduring Curiosity, Aven Interrupter, and Angswift Savior, made a 1-2 punch of powerful ways to interact with your opponent while you were playing High Noon to limit their ability to play things, and Voice of Victory so they couldn't do things on your turn. Lightstall Inquisitor as a 2-1 Vigilance. It also just taxed a card from their hand early on. It was a very powerful early game thing that could, even though it would die to a stiff breeze, still put them in an awkward position as you just start attacking for a decent amount of damage and trying to close the gap as soon as possible. Tishana's Tidebinder in the main deck, as well as some copies being run in some of these sideboards, was a way to kind of shut down some powerful enters the battlefield effects, or even things like Monuments to Endurance from these Lessons decks. And then you also have the sideboard being more catered towards a mid-range grindy style. Sure, you have Clarion Conquerors, but you have Pinnacle Starcage, Bays of the Bounding Spring, and most importantly, things like Cryptic Coat, so you can play a longer style of game against some of these more mid-range Ouroboroid grindy piles. If you love modern humans, you're going to love 4-color allies in Standard. The biggest reason that this deck is existing, besides Cavern Souls being a thing, is the fact that Earth King's Lieutenant is Thalia's Lieutenant. It's a 1/1 for 2. This one has Trample, but it has the Thalia's Lieutenant text. All you have to do is replace the word human with ally, which means that your board is going to be getting big fast. You of course also splash into black for Boiling Rock Rioter, which is a 3/3 and the only black card in the list basically. And while it allows your allies to tap to hate on opposing graveyards like Lessons and Sultai Reanimator decks, it basically functions as a reanimation spell for your own allies if your opponent isn't doing any graveyard shenanigans you need to worry about. You can cast allies you own from exile whenever this creature attacks, and you get Firebending 1, so you can actually get extra mana to do so as well. There are a ton of powerful allies in the format thanks to Avatar's set in general. Earthen Ally is a 0/2 for 1 that gets +1/+0 for each color among allies you control. So this is going to be a 4/2 pretty darn quick. You end up having the Great Divide Guide to make all of your allies into mana dorks, and then all of these ETB effects get doubled by Katara the Fearless, a 3 mana, one of each Bant color ally that says if a triggered ability of an ally you control triggers, the ability triggers an additional time. That lets you do things like with your South Pole Voyager, getting extra life. You get to draw a card if it's the second time an ally has entered. That'll double. You draw 2 cards instead. You're gaining 2 life for every ally you put onto the battlefield. So you're gaining life. You're doing things. You're putting tons of counters on your creatures. And it's almost like you're playing Ouroboroid with how many counters you have on things. Hakoda Selfless Commander is the top end of the curve. It is a 4 mana 3/5 with Vigilance that not only lets you cast allies from the top of your library, and you can just look at the top card anytime with it, but you sacrifice it, give all of your creatures +0/+5, and they gain indestructible till end of turn. So if a code is on the battlefield, you basically have an Oracle Moldiah that also prevents board wipes. The deck in and of itself is extremely powerful, extremely synergistic, and I am expecting that a lot of players that are coming from Eternal formats, moving into Standard with the refresh on everything, they're going to be gravitating towards this deck because of how similar it plays to those older modern humans or Pioneer mono white human style decks.
So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head to head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering, online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others. Izzet Lessons, the most played deck in the format and one of the most expected decks to be at any of these Spotlight Series events, has an interesting kind of breakdown when you look at the top Presence decks that it played against. Now, all of the decks that were in the top half of Presence, it has a favorable matchup against. All the ones at the bottom end of that top 10 Presence, it has an unfavorable matchup against, except for the Boros aggro list where it's actually slightly favored again. So all in all, this just gave the deck a pretty even spread against the field. Now what this says is that the Izzet Lessons pilots either had a lot of practice against the decks that were being played in large quantities and figured out how to play the matchup, or they had cards in them that were specifically targeted at some of those matches. However, looking at the different types of decks in that range, Simic Ouroboroid, Dimir Midrange, Jeskai Control, Sultai Reanimator, there's a lot of different decks doing a lot of different things, which makes me think that the Izzet Lessons deck is just a good matchup in stock general against them. However, Mono Red Aggro with the Ping package, it was basically built to take on this deck. The fact that that list had a the Izzet Lessons deck had a 46.9% win rate against that deck was actually the best out of this bottom half is concerning for mono red players, even though it's still under 50% for the Lessons deck. You'd think that that deck has that much better of a matchup since it was built to take down the Lessons deck, drawing a bunch of cards. However, the other Izzet versions of the deck, like Izzet Looting, had a slightly better game plan to attack them and a little bit more interaction
for some of the things they were doing, maybe even some more targeted hate pieces. So that was a rougher matchup for the Izzet Lessons deck, and the onslaught of landfall decks are able to attack the deck where it's weakest, like the first 3 turns of the game, was very powerful, and we're actually able to go faster than the Izzet Lessons deck was able to set up. One of the big things, of course, is the fact that you don't have a lot of board wipe type effects in Izzet colors. A lot of your things are Pyroclasm, Fire Magic, these smaller damage-based removal spells that the landfall creatures very quickly grow out of range for when you're putting +1/+1 counters on them for just basically playing your lands, and fetching, putting 2 counters on things in a single turn. So the Izzet Lessons deck, even with a target on its head, was above average overall, was even stronger in non-mirror matches where it played almost 300 of those. So all in all, the Izzet Lessons deck is still a very powerful deck to play. It's still going to be one of the top presence decks at your RCQs and online, and is probably going to be something you have to keep an eye out for even as we move into RC season when Lorwyn comes out. So we already know that Simic Ouroboroid did very good overall at the tournament, so I had a very high win rate against the field. He even had a higher win rate, a full percentage point higher, in fact, against the non-mirror matches. Now, looking at its spread against the top 10 presence decks in the room, we could see why it had such a high win rate. It basically ate up anything that wasn't Izzet Lessons or Jeskai Control that was at the tournament. Specifically looking at like the Sultai Reanimator and the Mono Green Landfall list, where it was boasting basically a 75% win rate against those decks. So the Simic Ouroboroid is the real deal when it comes to a large field of decks to play against. However, the Jeskai Control list was a list that pilots were picking up to specifically combat these Ouroboroid decks, and we did see it paying off a little bit here as the Ouroboroid Simic list only had a 47.3% win rate against it. Now, one of the big knocks that the Simic Ouroboroid list has is an unfavorable matchup into Izzet Lessons. 46.3% win rate for the Infinity Sky Noodle Plant deck is not necessarily where you want to be if Izzet Lessons continues to be the most played deck in the room. Now, against the mirror matchup, if you can figure out something to give you an edge or navigate that one, Simic Ouroboroid is probably going to be the second most played deck in the room. So if you can do that, you may wind up being able to take it to a local RCQ and still performing well against a field of Izzet Lessons decks. And if people continue to play things like Dimir and Sultai in your area, then yeah, the Simic Ouroboroid list is going to be something that you can take to these events if you can afford it, because the deck is pretty expensive with 4 Badgermole Cubs, 4 Ouroboroids, and a plethora of other cards thrown against it. Now, in a large open field style event, Simic Ouroboroid is a list that I would suggest taking over the Izzet Lessons deck just because its matchup spread looks so much better, especially when you're playing against a closed deck list field that you may not know what to expect from. Dimir Doomers, Dimir Copers, I'm not really here to argue with either side of that kind of debate that's been going on throughout social media recently. All I'm saying is that someone that played Dimir all throughout the VV Cauldron era, I get why people are drawn to the deck. It looks like it can do so many different things. However, looking at the matchup spread, it can only do pretty specific things. Those things are basically beat up on Jeskai Control and the Sultai Reanimator decks. Now, you would think that the Dimir decks would have a better win rate against the Mono Green Landfall, and the Selesnya Landfall list did have a slightly higher win rate against Selesnya than Mono Green, but it really kind of depends on what the removal package you're running is going to be. If you don't have copies of Nowhere to Run in your Dimir midrange list, you're going to want to put a couple in there because that's going to shut off things like Snakeskin Veil, it's going to shut off Overprotect, it's going to do all these other things that like will give hexproof and stuff. You shut that off to give access to your other removal spells. Now, the downside is that against the field and against a lot of the other top 10 presence decks here, Dimir really struggles. Most specifically, it really struggles against the Simic Ouroboroid list, which is going to be a large majority of the field, especially in online events where you don't have to physically pay money for the deck. You can just rent it or potentially, play against people who have all access accounts or an all access token or something like that eventually. So the Dimir list really needs some tweaks, or really needs some oomph to deal with some of those decks. Day of Black Sun is just not cutting it, especially when you have to like tap out for 4 to kill an Ouroboroid. And then, it also kills all of your things. Now, Lorwyn Eclipse is going to be bringing a new plethora of Dimir Truthers into the format because it is Blue-Black Fairies time. Spell Stutter is still a card. We have Fey Bloom Trick. maybe there's something that you can work with there. But what I'm telling you, Dimir mages, is you might want to look at the Azorius side of things, because at least you get access to High Noon, and that's going to be a better Izzet matchup for you. Jeskai control came out in droves because, well, board wipes are generally pretty good against green creature piles, and that's what it wound up doing against the Simic Ouroboroid list. 52.7% win rate in that head-to-head matchup was pretty decent for the deck. Now, it did wind up doing pretty well against some of the more middle of the pack of these top 10 presence lists as well. Sultai Reanimator, when you get to run Rest in Pieces and permission spells against a deck that wants to try to combo off using its graveyard, turns out you get a good win rate against it. Some of these other decks that were playing to the board, more creature style as well, Izzet Looting and the ping version of mono red aggro, were punished by with permission and just the board control that the Jeskai list were bringing. Also, the fact that cards like Stock Up and Consult the Star Charts don't actually draw cards, so the ping aspect of the mono red deck really didn't do anything for it besides slow it down in a matchup where it needs to be really fast. Speaking of speed, the Landfall decks were very resilient against the control matchup. They go very quickly, and they have ways to protect some of their creatures, making them indestructible, hexproof against the right things, and in some cases they have Cavernous Souls that can just stick something and be able to force it through, even through permission spells. Now again, the Jeskai control list was pretty good against the Boros versions of aggro, as you're able to deal with spells on the stack and creatures on the board extremely well. Now, it did struggle against Dimir, surprisingly. The Dimir matchup was a little more in the favor of the Kaito deck. Kaito is a little bit of a pain point for the Jeskai list to deal with, specifically when you can't counterspell it because it's going to be ninjutsu'd in, and then you have to use like a get lost specifically on it to get rid of it. And it did struggle against the Izzet Lessons deck, where the Izzet Lessons deck is playing a ton of spells, drawing a bunch of cards, and it's not really attacking you or playing to the board. You have to deal with its Monument to Endurance and its Artist Talent, and in the grand scheme of things, it just wasn't necessarily good enough in the forms that the Jeskai control lists were running to deal with that package of things as opposed to the creature lists. I do think that Jeskai control in its spot right now is going to have to decide which of the top two decks it wants to attack more. Is it Lessons or Simic Ouroboroid? I don't think it's going to really be able to have a really good matchup against both of those decks. It needs its sideboard slots to deal with those two decks are doing in different ways, and because of that, you kind of have to decide what the rest of the metagame looks like and how it's going to fall, the dominoes are going to fall there. I think the versions right now that are trying to attack Ouroboroid packages are going to be a little bit more favorable. As you can see, 50.2% win rate against non-mirror matches means that in general, the field's going to be playing creatures. Things that are good against creatures are going to be halfway decent. So that's the version of control that I would run. You may just have to take your lumps with some of these Izzet Lessons matchups. The Sultai Spider-Man or Sultai Reanimator deck was not in as good as a position as it was in previous events like at Worlds, with a 44.2% win rate in non-mirror matches and 44.1% win rate overall. It was just not it was not a good deck for this event. It just, there's so much graveyard hate that's flying around now because of decks like Izzet Lessons, as well as some of the combos that are utilizing the graveyard. Like we wound up seeing the Golgari one. Yeah, there's only one deck that was in that one, but still, graveyard usage is very, very high in standard right now, and Sultai Reanimator was eating a lot of the flack because of that. Now, some of the lists that weren't necessarily as catered to attacking graveyards is Looting and the mono red aggro decks that mainly just have maybe some Soul Guide Lanterns, or maybe even forwent some of the sideboard graveyard hate. Those were the only matches where Sultai Reanimator had a positive win rate against the top 10 presence decks. It was not fast enough to deal with the Landfall decks, it was too slow to deal with the Boros aggro deck, and unfortunately just could not contend with what the Ouroboroid decks were doing. Now, I mean, you can in some cases get a very good combo turn, especially if you do it very early on against the Ouroboroid list, but the Ouroboroid decks are going to be having creatures that are attacking, blocking in its own graveyard, and in some cases your living end combo isn't going to be as potent as you wished it was. Against the Lessons deck, you were pretty close to 50% win rate. It was 48%, or it was slightly more in favor of the Izzet Lessons deck. So if Sultai Reanimator can shore up that matchup, you're still going to wind up eating the bad Simic Ouroboroid matchup. So you really need to try to find a way to make Izzet Lessons that much better than Ouroboroid to really make Reanimator a choice going into future tournaments. The one thing that the Reanimator list does have going for it in Lorwyn are the new Evoke Elementals, specifically the ones that can draw cards and remove enchantments or artifacts from the battlefield. That may be an edge that the Reanimator deck gets. You play those for 2. You can copy them with your Superior Spider-Man in the graveyard and get both sides of the coin if you wind up paying the appropriate mana for it. And you can bring them back with a Superior Spider-Man for a living end effect that then gets you extra ETB effects as well. I know there were a lot of people that were very high on Izzet looting coming into the event, and even though it didn't necessarily have the same representation in decks that Izzet Lessons or Simic or Ouroboroid had, I thought it was going to be pretty up there as far as top 10 presence decks go. Now, it did wind up being in the bottom half of the presence ratings, but it's still within the top 10, so I can't really fault people for not playing it too much because it's still a top 10 presence deck. In general, the power of Tiger Seal, Quantum Riddler, and Duelist of the Mind in combination with Frostcliff Siege is a very awesome thing to see, and this is kind of the evolution of where all those old VV Cauldron creatures went. We wind up having Winter Night stories in this deck as well. But in some cases, the Izzet looting deck may be a little bit too fair, especially in the case of the Simic or Ouroboroid list, where they're throwing down basically their entire deck on the battlefield as soon as possible. The Izzet looting list, again, because you don't wind up having any board wipes that are very powerful in the Izzet colors, you very quickly get outclassed if you let your opponent put too many things onto the battlefield. So if you don't wind up having an answer to like a turn 2 Badger Mole Cub on the draw, you're in a very bad spot. Spell Snare in Lorwyn is going to help with that. Torch the Tower is going to help with that as well. So there are ways that you can do it. However, Izzet looting did have a very good win rate, 59.1% into the Izzet Lessons deck. So if you are going to be facing a field of fellow Izzet players, this is where I think a lot of people had a very high opinion of Izzet looting, because you were able to kind of run over the Lessons deck because you had very similar interactive spells that they did, potentially better versions because you didn't have to run the Lessons, and then you had Frostcliff Siege to help literally run over, and flying creatures like Duelist of the Mind to literally go above whatever little otters and grands they had on the battlefield. Now, looking at some of the other lists, it's slightly unfavorable, leaning into just straight up unfavorable for Izzet looting, and against the field, a 48.9% win rate in both overall and non-mirror matches just goes to echo that the field is prepared to deal with creatures on the battlefield a little bit better than it is at dealing with things like Monument to Endurance or just way too many creatures on the battlefield. So Izzet looting may be a little bit of a difficult spot to play, considering you only have 16 main deck creatures and then the 4 Storm Chasers talents in a lot of these lists, which means you're oftentimes only doing 1 or 2 things on the battlefield. And even as powerful as Tiger Seal is, it still dies to shoot the sheriff. The mono-red aggro list that was really leaning on Razorkin Needlehead and Ohir Axonil wasn't really putting up the results that the other mono-red decks had previously been doing. Now, what it did punish extremely well was Enduring Curiosity and all of the draw spells coming out of the Izzet Lessons deck and Monument to Endurance in and of itself, as well as like the Artist Talent, right? All those draw card effects were punished the way that the red deck wanted it to do. However, the rest of the field was kind of left unpunished. It's interesting to see, actually, that the Simic or Ouroboroid list was only a 47.8% win rate in favor of mono red, much closer to 50-50 than I thought that matchup would be. So there may be something in here with the way this deck is functioning. Maybe it's running less Ohiras and maybe running more Scalding Viper type effects as well. That may be a way to kind of just make your deck a little bit faster and maybe combat what the Ouroboroid list is doing in its first couple of turns and delay them enough so that they're not able to really utilize Quantum Riddler to rebuild, because you're going to be damaging them every single time they do. However, Sultai Reanimator, bad matchup. Landfall decks, bad matchup. Boros with burn spells and everything, bad matchup. Izzet looting, a little bit bigger than the Lessons decks and things like that, bad matchup. So mono red, you got to do something a little bit different than just putting Ohir Axonil in there and calling it a day. You may have to go back to your tried and true, more aggressive routes if you want a really red deck win. Mono green Landfall was the one that had just 1 extra deck in the room compared to its Selesnya brethren. It'll be interesting to see where these 2 decks that are pretty similar in their construction have their differences in their head-to-head matchups. Just right away, you could look that Obviously, the mirror matches here are going to be 50-50, mono green versus mono green, but even against the Selesnya deck, it's 50-50 because it's basically mono green versus mono green. Now, the Landfall decks were built to beat up on lessons, but they both struggle against the Simic Ouroboroid list. Mono green Landfall had a very good matchup against Dimir midrange, as they were just going to be running over Kaito and company, but it did wind up struggling against the Boros aggro list, as that deck was going to be more built to burning away their things as they started playing them, and especially like if you're trying to play a Chocobo on the draw and they just have a Torch the Tower or something else, even just a Shock or a Burst Lightning, it's going to kill a lot of those creatures very early on. But they were punishing some of the slower decks, punished Jeskai control very hard. It actually was better, and then the mono red deck and the head-to-head matchup for aggro, because they're trying to play Ohirax O'Neil and Razorkin Needlehead, and you just don't draw cards, you just kind of run over them with your land base. So mono green Landfall, overall 54.0% win rate against the field and non-mirrors. Very powerful deck and probably the place to go for aggro players, unless you start playing the Selesnya Landfall deck, which very similar matchup spread, but by comparison to the mono green list, was doing a couple things differently. The first thing is losing to Dimir midrange. 49% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. It's fairly close to 50-50, but the 66.7% win rate of mono green Landfall means that there's something going on with maybe just the amount of protection spells and stuff that you're running instead. Now, we wound up having a slightly less win rate against the Sultai Reanimator list, which is interesting because the Selesnya Landfall deck does have access to running like Rest in Peace in the sideboard if they wanted to. I don't think there were very many lists that were doing it, but it's something that could be used to shore up that matchup if it does seem to be a little bit more difficult for some reason. However, it was a more winning matchup in the Izzet looting and the mono red matches, probably because of the fact that you were adding in later game plans like Felidar Retreat against the Izzet looting deck that was going a little bit bigger, but you also had access to spot removal like Get Lost, which is going to be very, very powerful in these specific matchups. It also had a slightly better win rate against the Boros aggro list, but it was still a losing win rate for the Landfall matchup there. So depending on what you're going to expect in your metagame, you can choose between mono green and Selesnya Landfall based off of this head-to-head matchup matrix to see if you're going to quote-unquote tech for the slightly better matchup, or if you want the better deck against the field. Selesnya Landfall did have a 0.6 percentage points better non-mirror win rate than mono green. The Boros aggro list were moving in the direction I think that the mono red aggro list should go, playing a bunch of to the ground creatures, playing a bunch of burn spells, and then potentially alternating between prowess or just really strong creatures and playing things potentially like Slickshot Show Off. The list in and of itself was much faster than what mono red was trying to do at this tournament. Because of that, it had a very good matchup into some of the decks that mono red struggled against. We wound up having a very good Sultai Reanimator matchup because you actually were a little bit faster than that deck in some cases, and Slickshot Show Off could actually steal games potentially out of nowhere, especially through some very good pumps and burn spells, and you actually were better off against the Landfall varieties of these decks, both Selesnya and mono green. Mono green a little bit more because they were not really able to deal with your own creatures, so Slickshot Show Offs and other prowess threats often went unanswered, at least in game number ones. But yeah, in general, the Boros aggro list just had ways to deal with creatures on the battlefield a little bit better than what mono red was doing, and it even actually bled a little bit into some of the other tougher matchups. Now, the one thing that Boros aggro did not have that mono red had was a good win rate into Izzet lessons. Now, 48.2% is below 50%, fairly close, but almost 2% off is pretty significant. But again, the mono red deck was built to fight Izzet lessons, so it had a positive win rate, 53.1% in that head-to-head there. Now, Boros aggro also struggled against the Simic Ouroboroid and the Jeskai control list. It struggled more against Ouroboroid than mono red. It was a little bit better off against Jeskai than mono red was, but all in all, the Boros aggro deck did take some lumps in the top end of the metagame, so that may be a slight concern for trying to run this deck at your RCQs or specifically online. Now, one thing that it did do was had a good win rate against the field. 51.8% in both overall and non-mirror matches means that the Boros aggro deck could be good for a closed deck or a small event like a local RCQ if you want to play a red-based aggressive deck. Spotlight the Avatar gave us a lot to look forward to as we're entering the global RC season for Standard. Lore and Eclipse is just on the horizon. There's a bunch of new cards that are going to be injected in there. What archetypes do you think are going to be standouts that survive Lauren coming in, and which ones do you think are going to get an actual boost from it? I mentioned the Sultai Reanimator deck. Let me know what your feelings are down in the comments below. While you're there, give a thumbs up to this video if you've enjoyed it. It's a bit longer. I've done some newer things in there. Leave me your feedback and let me know how you like some of those changes. And if you like this video and the types of content I do on my channel, you could consider clicking that join button down below or on my channel's homepage to monetarily support me and my channel, much like my members. Members do get good membership perks, like they get Discord access, so we can chat about your deck list, we can talk about your results from different tournaments, where we could just kind of shoot the shit when it comes to doing different things around the Magic the Gathering scene. You also get early access to content, members only content as well, and you're going to be able to just get a little bit more look behind the scenes of the channel. So if you are so monetarily inclined to support the channel that way, you can click the join button down below or on my channel homepage to show your devotion. Although you can, for just cheap as free, tap that subscribe button. It helps me and it helps you stay up to date on all my latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content. If you're going to Portland, I'll see you there. Happy RCing!